Touching the alien queen meant death, but the human man held her hands without hesitation. James had been on 17 alien worlds before arriving at the celestial spire, and he'd learned that the universe had a peculiar sense of humor about who it put in charge of things. On Kepler 442b, the planetary administrator was a methane-breathing jellyfish with anxiety issues. On Proxima Centauri C, the trade commissioner was a hive mind that couldn't agree with itself about lunch, let alone tariff negotiations. But nobody had prepared him for Queen Luna of the Astria, whose people had apparently decided that their monarch should be treated less like a head of state and more like a museum exhibit behind velvet ropes. The shuttle descent gave him his first glimpse of the palace, and James had to admit it was impressive even by galaxy-spanning civilization standards. The celestial spire rose from the planet's surface like a frozen waterfall of light, its crystalline structure catching the system's binary suns and scattering rainbows across the cloudless sky. Somewhere in there, wrapped in protocols older than human spaceflight, was the woman he'd be working alongside for the next year, assuming he didn't accidentally cause an intergalactic incident in the first week. The odds were not in his favor. Karis met him at the landing platform, a bundle of nervous energy wrapped in formal robes that seemed designed to make their wearer trip on stairs. The Astria administrator clutched a data tablet against his chest like a shield, his long ears twitching with barely contained stress. "Ambassador James, welcome. Yes, welcome to the Spire. We're so pleased Earth has sent a cultural liaison, though I must emphasize the importance of proper protocol, especially given the sensitive nature of the Queen's position. Not that we doubt your capabilities, of course, but there are certain absolute rules that simply cannot be—" "Breathe, Karis," James suggested, shouldering his travel pack. "I promise I read the briefing materials, all 400 pages of them. Twice." "Did you read the appendices? There were appendices?" Karis made a sound like a small animal in distress. The interior of the spire was even more magnificent than the exterior, all soaring corridors and chambers that seemed to exist in more dimensions than strictly necessary. James followed Karis through hallways where the walls shifted colors based on the time of day, past courtyards where water flowed upward in defiance of physics, around corners that shouldn't geometrically connect to the spaces they led to. His guide maintained a running commentary of dire warnings about decorum, respect, and the absolutely critical importance of maintaining proper distance from the Queen. "So let me get this straight," James said, consulting his notes on his handheld display as they walked. "I need to stay at least 3 meters away at all times, unless formal protocol requires a specific distance of 2.7 meters, which is different from informal protocol that requires 3.2 meters, and under no circumstances should I ever," and I'm quoting here, "approach within the sacred boundary of her radiance." "Exactly correct, yes." Karis looked relieved that James was taking this seriously. "And what happens if I accidentally get too close? Do I explode? Does she explode? Does the space-time continuum develop a really awkward hiccup?" "You would be executed by the Royal Guard," Karis said matter-of-factly. "Probably instantly. They're very efficient." James stopped walking. "I'm sorry, executed?" "Well, not for distance violations alone, obviously. That would be excessive." Karis consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be an extremely long document. "Distance violations result in immediate expulsion and permanent ban from Astria space. But physical contact with the Queen, that carries a death sentence. It's been law for over 3,000 years. Very traditional. The Astria people believe their monarchs are divine vessels, you see, living connections to the stellar energies that birthed our civilization. To touch the Queen is to profane the sacred, to disrupt the cosmic balance, got it, no touching. Add that to the list right under, remember to breathe and try not to start any wars. They reached what Karis called the orientation chamber, which turned out to be a room full of holographic displays showing proper bowing techniques, acceptable conversation topics, and a truly bewildering array of hand gestures that apparently meant different things depending on whether you were standing or sitting, whether the Queen was currently glowing or just moderately luminescent, and what phase the larger of the two moons happened to be in. James watched a hologram demonstrate the 17-step process for requesting permission to speak during a formal audience, and wondered, not for the first time, if humanity's greatest contribution to the galactic community might simply be demonstrating that it was possible to accomplish things without drowning in your own bureaucracy. "When do I actually meet Her Majesty?" he asked after absorbing what felt like the social equivalent of a doctoral thesis. Karis's ears drooped slightly. "The treaty signing ceremony is in 3 days. That will be your first encounter. It's a significant event, 12 species, 7 trade agreements, and the formal establishment of Earth's cultural exchange program. Queen Luna will be presiding naturally. It's her first public appearance since—" He trailed off, suddenly very interested in his tablet. Since her sister's death, 3 months ago. Terraforming accident on the colony world of Astria Prime. The princess was overseeing the atmospheric processors when the containment fields failed. Karis's voice had gone soft. "The queen has been in mourning. Private mourning, of course. Public displays of grief are not considered appropriate for divine monarchs." James thought about that, about a woman who couldn't even cry for her sister without violating cosmic protocol. And suddenly all the elaborate rules felt less like tradition and more like a very beautiful cage. The 3 days passed in a blur of protocol briefings, cultural sensitivity training, and one memorable incident where James accidentally triggered a holographic alarm by standing in what turned out to be a ceremonial meditation zone. Karis had nearly fainted. James had apologized profusely while privately wondering if the entire palace was booby-trapped with invisible etiquette landmines. Now he stood in the antechamber of the Hall of Reflected Starlight, wearing what Earth's diplomatic corps optimistically called formal attire, and what James suspected made him look like a waiter at a very expensive restaurant. Around him, representatives from a dozen species checked their appearance in surfaces that weren't quite mirrors, adjusted clothing that defied conventional physics, and radiated the particular anxiety of people about to participate in something historically significant. "Remember," Karis whispered urgently at his elbow, "3rd row, 5th position from the left. Do not deviate. When the queen enters, the standing bow is exactly 45 degrees for precisely 3 seconds. When she reaches the dais, you may sit, but only after the Centauri delegation sits, and absolutely before the Rigelian ambassador sits. Because if you sit after the Rigelians, it implies Earth considers itself subordinate to their trade consortium, which would undermine 6 months of negotiations." "Karis, buddy, I'm going to level with you," James said, straightening his collar. "There's about a 60% chance I'm going to mess up at least one of these things. Maybe we should just accept that now and save ourselves the stress." Karis made that small animal noise again. The doors to the hall opened with a sound like singing crystal, and James forgot about protocol entirely. The chamber was vast, its ceiling lost in what might have been actual starlight, or possibly the most advanced holographic projection he'd ever seen. The floor was polished stone that reflected the light from above, creating the dizzying impression of walking through space itself. Rows of seats, each designed for wildly different anatomies, curved in a gentle arc facing a raised platform where the treaty documents waited on a table that appeared to be carved from a single piece of luminous amber. James found his assigned seat, managed the bow without falling over, and settled in between a Centauri diplomat whose translator kept rendering everything she said as aggressive disappointment, and a human trade representative named Sarah who leaned over and whispered, "20 credits says someone faints during the ceremony. These things run long, and the Astria don't believe in air conditioning." "You're on," James whispered back. "My money's on the Rigelian. They're already looking purple." A deep tone resonated through the hall, vibrating in frequencies that James felt in his chest, and everyone rose. The queen was entering. Luna appeared at the far end of the hall, walking with measured grace between 2 lines of her royal guard. James had seen her image in briefing materials, but nothing had prepared him for the reality. She wore robes that seemed to be woven from captured moonlight, their fabric shifting between silver and pearl and the pale blue of distant nebulae. Her long ears, adorned with delicate chains of worked metal, caught the light with each step. But it was her skin that truly arrested attention, that ethereal white luminescence that made her seem less solid than the space around her, as if she existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. Her golden eyes swept the assembled dignitaries with practiced neutrality, her expression a perfect mask of serene authority. James noticed she walked as if there were invisible walls around her, maintaining that sacred distance even in motion. The guards flanking her stayed exactly 3 paces back. No more, no less. She reached the dais and turned to face them, and James saw what he suspected no one else was meant to see. The faint tremor in her hands before she clasped them together, the way her luminescence flickered slightly, like a light bulb with a loose connection. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The tension in her shoulders, that perfect posture, couldn't quite hide. Distinguished representatives of the Galactic Alliance, Luna's voice carried through the hall without amplification, musical and controlled. We gather today to formalize bonds of cooperation and mutual prosperity between our civilizations. May these agreements bring stability to our systems and understanding between our peoples. The ceremony began with all the efficiency of a glacier crossing a continent. Each delegation rose in turn to make formal statements that James suspected had been workshopped by committees for months. The Centauri spoke for 15 minutes about trade route optimization. The Rigelians delivered what was either a passionate speech about economic cooperation or an elaborate complaint about shipping container standardization. The translator seemed uncertain. A delegation from the Tau Ceti system spent 20 minutes on what James was 70% sure was just an elaborate, humble brag about their terraforming technology. When Earth's turn came, Ambassador Chen delivered a mercifully brief statement about cultural exchange and humanity's enthusiasm for learning from older civilizations, with only 2 subtle digs at the Rigelian Trade Consortium. James caught Luna's eyes tracking to Chen during one particularly pointed remark about fair market practices, and he could have sworn he saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Then came the signing itself. Luna descended from the dais, and the crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath as she approached the treaty table. Her attendants had placed the documents at precise intervals, each positioned so she could sign without requiring anyone to hand her anything. James watched the elaborate dance of distances, the careful choreography that kept everyone in their designated zones, and thought again about that beautiful cage. She reached for the first stylus, a ceremonial instrument that probably cost more than James's entire education, and he saw her hand shake, just slightly, just enough. Luna signed the Centauri agreement with careful precision, her luminescence steady. She moved to the Rigelian document, and James noticed her pause, barely perceptible before continuing. By the 3rd treaty, her glow had dimmed noticeably, though her expression remained serene. The 4th signature took longer than the others. Sarah leaned over. Is it just me, or does the Queen look like she's about 2 minutes from passing out? Not just you, James murmured, sitting up straighter. Around them, other observers were beginning to notice. The Astria courtiers exchanged worried glances. Karis, standing along the wall, had gone pale. Luna reached for Earth's treaty document, the second-to-last signature required. Her hand extended toward the stylus, wavered, and James saw her sway almost imperceptibly. Her luminescence flickered like a candle in wind. He was already moving when her knees buckled. James's chair clattered backward, the sound impossibly loud in the sudden silence. His feet carried him forward on pure instinct, crossing the 3 meters of sacred space in 3 strides that felt both endless and instantaneous. His hands, very human, very unauthorized, completely forbidden, reached out and caught Luna's as she fell forward, steadying her before she could collapse onto the treaty table. The moment their skin made contact, the universe seemed to fracture into crystalline chaos. Every guard in the hall drew their weapons simultaneously, a sound like 100 blades singing free of their sheaths. The Astria dignitaries made a collective noise of horror that would have been comical if James wasn't fairly certain he was about to be executed. Someone, possibly Karis, actually screamed. The translator units struggled to keep up with the multilingual explosion of shock rippling through the assembled delegates. But James didn't let go. Luna's hands felt cool and smooth in his grip, her skin carrying a faint electric tingle that might have been the luminescence or might have been something else entirely. She was shaking, her whole body trembling with exhaustion she could no longer hide, and her golden eyes had gone wide with absolute shock as they locked onto his face. "Easy," James said quietly, acutely aware that at least 15 weapons were now pointed at various parts of his anatomy. "I've got you." For 3 heartbeats, nothing moved. The hall of reflected starlight had become the hall of frozen horror, every being locked in place by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. James could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears, could feel the slight pressure of Luna's fingers against his palms, could see the way her luminescence had brightened slightly at the points where their skin touched. Then Luna laughed. It was a small sound, breaking and genuine and completely unexpected. It started as something between a gasp and a chuckle, then grew into real laughter that shook her shoulders and brought the faintest color to her luminous cheeks. Her fingers tightened around James's hands as if he were the only solid thing in a universe that had suddenly stopped making sense. "You," she said, her musical voice cracking slightly, "are either the bravest human I have ever met or the most cosmically foolish." "I'm going with Dr. Number 2, James replied, managing a shaky smile despite the weapon situation. "Foolish has always been more my speed. Are you all right?" "I am standing upright instead of sprawled across a treaty table in front of 12 species worth of dignitaries, so I am considerably better than I was 5 seconds ago." Her laughter had subsided, but her eyes still held that bright, slightly unhinged gleam of someone whose perfect composure had just been thoroughly shattered. "Though you may have noticed, you are about to be killed very efficiently by my guards." "Yeah, I picked up on that." The whole swords-drawn thing was a pretty clear context clue. Faith, the chief of the Royal Guard, had recovered from her shock and was now advancing with her weapon raised and her expression suggesting that James's execution was going to be both immediate and educational for anyone else considering breaking ancient laws. She barked something in the Astria language that James's translator rendered as a highly creative description of his intelligence, lineage, and probable afterlife arrangements. "Stand down," Luna said. The words cut through the chaos with surprising strength, considering she was still using James as a stabilizing post. Vaith stopped mid-stride. "Your Majesty, the law is absolute." "The law," Luna interrupted, finally releasing James's hands but not stepping away from him, "states that unauthorized touch of the divine monarch is punishable by death. However, I believe preventing one's queen from face-planting into the Centauri trade agreement like a malfunctioning gravity compensator might fall under exceptional circumstances." Several delegates made strangled noises. The Centauri ambassador looked personally offended by the imagery. "Your Majesty?" Vaith tried again, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining protocol in a situation that had blown past protocol and into uncharted territory. 3,000 years of tradition? 3,000 years of tradition did not account for our monarchs being so isolated that they collapsed from grief and exhaustion during treaty signings. Luna's voice had strengthened, her luminescence returning to its full radiance. "This human has broken our law, yes. He has also prevented his queen from collapsing in front of the assembled alliance like some fainting maiden from an Earth Victorian novel." James couldn't help himself. "To be fair, Your Majesty, Victorian ladies had the good sense to faint with considerably more advance warning and better structural support garments. I understand corsets were involved." The hall had gone silent again, but this time the quality of silence was different. Less horror, more disbelief. Luna turned to look at him fully, her golden eyes meeting his, and for a moment James saw past the divine monarch to the exhausted woman underneath. The person who hadn't been touched in 7 years, who'd lost her sister and couldn't even cry about it, who'd just been caught by a complete stranger and found it funny instead of profane. "You just committed a capital offense," she said slowly, "and you were making jokes about corsets." "I find humor helps in situations where I'm probably about to die. It's a coping mechanism. Not a great one, admittedly, but I'm working with what I've got." Luna's laugh this time was fuller, more real, bright enough that her luminescence seemed to pulse with it. Around the hall, weapons began to lower incrementally as everyone tried to process the unprecedented sight of their perfect, untouchable queen, laughing with genuine delight at a human who should have been dead already. "Ambassador James," she said, and there was something new in her voice, something warm and alive that hadn't been there during her formal speech. "You have broken our oldest law, and you have made me laugh at my own near collapse during the most important diplomatic ceremony of the decade. I find myself uncertain whether to thank you or have you ejected from the nearest airlock. Could I maybe suggest a third option, where I sign Earth's treaty, and we all pretend this was a very brief cultural exchange demonstration? No, Luna said. But she was smiling now, really smiling, and the expression transformed her face from divine icon to living person. I have a significantly better idea. Luna turned to address the assembled delegates, and James noticed that she'd shifted her stance slightly, no longer maintaining the careful isolation that had marked every movement before. She stood as herself now, not as a living icon, and somehow that made her more commanding rather than less. Distinguished representatives, she began, her voice carrying that perfect clarity again, but with a new warmth underneath it. You have just witnessed something that has not occurred in Astria history for over 3,000 years. A foreign dignitary has touched your queen, and your queen has not only survived this apparently catastrophic event, but has found herself significantly improved by it. Murmuring rippled through the crowd. Several Astria courtiers looked like they were having minor existential crises. Karras had actually sat down on the floor, his tablet forgotten in his lap. For 3 millennia, Luna continued, my people have wrapped their monarchs in laws designed to honor and protect us. We are divine vessels, connections to the stellar energies that birthed our civilization, living embodiments of cosmic balance. She paused, her golden eyes sweeping the hall. We are also, it turns out, people. People who can stumble from exhaustion. People who sometimes need someone to catch them when they fall. James stood very still, acutely aware that half the weapons in the room were still sort of pointed in his general direction, even if they'd lowered somewhat. Vaith looked like she was personally wrestling with several competing impulses, none of which involved letting him leave the hall alive. The law states that unauthorized touch carries a death sentence, Luna said, and James's stomach dropped. However, I believe we must examine what unauthorized truly means. Ambassador James acted to prevent harm to a head of state during an official diplomatic function. One could argue this falls well within his duties as Earth's representative. One could argue a lot of things when one is trying not to be executed, James muttered under his breath. Sarah, still in her seat, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Luna's ears twitched, suggesting she'd heard him despite the distance. More importantly, I am forced to confront an uncomfortable truth that this incident has made impossible to ignore. Our traditions have become a prison. Our reverence has become isolation. I have not been touched by another being since my coronation 7 years ago. 7 years without a hand on my shoulder, without an embrace, without any physical confirmation that I exist as something more than a symbol. The hall had gone absolutely silent now, the kind of silence that felt like the universe holding its breath. My sister died 3 months ago. Luna's voice wavered slightly, but she pushed forward, and I could not hold anyone's hand while I grieved. I could not accept comfort. I could not even weep in the presence of others, because divine monarchs do not display such mortal weaknesses. Her luminescence flickered, then steadied with visible effort. These laws were meant to honor us. Instead, they have made us less than human. Ironic, considering the species that just demonstrated what compassion looks like. James felt heat creep up his neck. He hadn't thought about compassion or making political statements. He'd just seen someone falling and moved to catch them, the way any decent person would. The fact that it had violated 3,000 years of law was honestly more of a surprise than anything else. Therefore, Luna announced, and her voice had taken on the quality of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade, I am declaring a formal revision of the contact laws. Effective immediately, the prohibition on touching the Astria monarch is rescinded. We will develop new protocols that balance respect with the basic acknowledgement of our personhood. The explosion of noise was immediate and chaotic. Half the Astria delegation erupted in protest while the other half sat in shocked silence. The foreign diplomats looked at each other with the universal expression of people watching someone else's cultural revolution and trying to decide if they should take notes or evacuate. The Rigelian ambassador's translator gave up entirely and just started emitting a steady tone of confusion. Vaith stepped forward, her weapon finally sheathed but her expression thunderous. Your Majesty, This is not a decision to be made in a moment of emotional upheaval. Vaith, my friend, my most loyal protector, Luna said gently. When would be the appropriate time? After another 7 years of isolation? After I collapse again? Perhaps fatally next time? Because I have driven myself to exhaustion, trying to be something more than mortal? She shook her head, her ear chains chiming softly. The time is now precisely because this moment has made the cost impossible to ignore. She turned back to James, and he saw something in her golden eyes that might have been gratitude or might have been the slightly manic gleam of someone who'd just burned down their entire worldview and was feeling liberated by the flames. Ambassador James, she said formally, would you do me the honor of completing this treaty signing? I find I am no longer interested in performing these ceremonies in isolation. James glanced at the guards, at Vaith's disapproving glare, at the sea of shocked faces throughout the hall. Then he looked back at Luna, at the woman who just upended 3,000 years of tradition because a stranger had caught her when she fell. And he thought about corsets and Victorian novels and the absurdity of laws that turned people into untouchable icons. Your Majesty, he said, I would be absolutely delighted. Though I should warn you, I have terrible handwriting. Very undivine. Luna laughed again, bright and genuine, and offered him her hand. Deliberately, publicly, in full view of everyone. James took it, shook it with the same easy confidence he'd show anyone. And the simple, profoundly normal gesture felt like watching a cage door swing open. They signed the treaties together, Luna and James standing side by side at the amber table, while the assembled delegates watched with expressions ranging from fascination to horror to what James suspected was the beginning of several strongly worded diplomatic cables back to home governments. Luna's hand remained steady as she signed each document, her luminescence bright and unwavering. And when she handed James the stylus for Earth's treaty, their fingers brushed again with that same faint electric tingle. Your handwriting truly is appalling, Luna observed as James scrawled his signature across the designated line. It looks like you were writing during a gravity fluctuation. I was nervous. Signing historic documents, while possibly still under threat of execution, does that to a person. You were making corset jokes 30 seconds after committing a capital offense. I find your claim of nervousness suspect. James grinned despite himself. Fair point. My handwriting is just naturally terrible. It's a gift. The remaining signatures proceeded with significantly less drama than the first half of the ceremony, though James noticed that several of the Astria courtiers kept watching Luna as if expecting her to suddenly burst into flames or possibly ascend to a higher plane of existence now that she'd been touched by mortal hands. When the final document was signed, a complex multi-species environmental protection agreement that had apparently taken 18 months to negotiate, Luna stepped back from the table and addressed the assembly once more. The treaties are complete. May they bring prosperity and understanding to all our peoples. She paused, and James saw a flicker of something mischievous cross her face. I now invite all delegates to join us in the Garden of Reflected Pools for the traditional reception. Ambassador James, I would be honored if you would accompany me. We have much to discuss regarding Earth's cultural liaison position. Karis made a sound from his position along the wall that suggested his soul had just left his body. The garden turned out to be less a garden and more a physics-defying miracle of water, light, and plant life that probably shouldn't exist together. Pools floated at various heights, their surfaces perfect mirrors reflecting not the sky above, but what looked like distant nebulae. Flowering plants grew in spirals that twisted through impossible geometries, their blossoms emitting soft musical tones when the breeze touched them. Paths of crystalline stone wound through it all, somehow always leading exactly where you needed to go, even when that seemed to violate basic principles of navigation. James walked beside Luna along one of these paths, acutely aware of the guards maintaining a discreet distance. Farther back than before, he noticed, and the way every other being in the garden was pretending not to stare at them, while absolutely staring at them. So, he said conversationally, on a scale of 1 to galactic incident, how much trouble am I actually in? Luna tilted her head, considering. Politically, you have just become the most famous human in Astria space, and possibly triggered a cultural reformation that will be studied by sociologists for centuries. Personally, you saved me from a humiliating collapse and gave me permission to laugh at the absurdity of my own situation. She paused by one of the floating pools, her reflection shimmering in its surface, alongside images of distant stars. I would call that approximately a 7 on your scale. Significant, but manageable. And the whole death sentence thing? Officially pardoned approximately 3 minutes after I declared the law revision. Vaith was quite efficient about the paperwork, despite her obvious disapproval. Luna's lips quirked. She takes her duties very seriously, including the duty to keep her queen alive, even when her queen is making decisions that give Vaith digestive problems. James laughed, then sobered slightly. You really upended 3,000 years of tradition because I caught you when you fell. That's kind of enormous. You caught me when I fell, Luna echoed, which no one else in that hall would have done. Not because they did not care, but because the law forbade it. They would have let their queen collapse rather than risk breaking tradition. Her golden eyes met his. That is when I realized our laws had become more important than our people, that we had built such beautiful cages around ourselves that we had forgotten we were meant to be alive inside them. A small creature that looked like a cross between a bird and a jellyfish floated past, humming in harmony with the musical flowers. James watched it drift toward one of the upper pools, then looked back at Luna. Your sister, he said carefully. I'm sorry for your loss. I can't imagine going through that alone. Luna's luminescence dimmed slightly, but this time it felt intentional rather than a sign of weakness. Thank you, truly. She reached out and touched one of the floating pools, her fingers breaking the surface and sending ripples across the reflected nebula. Kessa was younger than me by 3 years. She was supposed to be at the coronation ceremony when I ascended, but she was off-world studying terraforming techniques because she said watching me stand still for 6 hours while priests chanted sounded boring. A soft laugh. She was right, of course. It was extraordinarily boring. She sounds like she was fun. She was infuriating and brilliant and completely irreverent about everything our culture considered sacred. She would have loved what you did today. Probably would have suggested you do it on purpose just to see what happened. They walked in companionable silence for a moment, the garden's musical flowers providing a gentle soundtrack. Other delegates had begun filtering into the space, forming small conversational clusters while maintaining what James suspected was a very deliberate distance from Luna and himself. The Centauri ambassador appeared to be having an intense discussion with several Astria courtiers, complete with emphatic hand gestures. So what happens now? James asked. With the cultural liaison position, I mean. I'm assuming my job description just got significantly more complicated. Luna's smile returned, bright and slightly dangerous. Ambassador James, you have just demonstrated that Earth's approach to outdated traditions involves ignoring them entirely in favor of basic human decency. I think your position has become less liaison and more revolutionary consultant. That's not remotely what my job description said when I accepted this posting. No, but think how much more interesting your reports back to Earth will be. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. I meant what I said in the hall. I want you at next week's council meeting, and the one after that. The Astria need to remember that our rulers are people, and apparently it takes a human who makes terrible jokes to remind us. James ended up at 17 council meetings over the following months, and by the 5th one, he'd stopped being surprised when Astria nobles actually shook his hand in greeting. By the 10th, Luna had started deliberately asking his opinion on matters of tradition versus practicality, usually right after some centuries-old protocol had ground important discussions to a halt. By the 15th, Vaith had stopped glaring at him with quite so much intensity, which James chose to interpret as progress rather than the chief guard simply accepting the inevitable heat death of everything she held sacred. The changes rippled outward faster than anyone had anticipated. Within weeks of the treaty signing, other Astria officials began cautiously relaxing their own isolation protocols. A governor on one of the outer colonies started attending public gatherings without the traditional 3-meter exclusion zone. A high priest gave a sermon about the difference between reverence and imprisonment that apparently caused theological arguments lasting 6 weeks. Someone started a social movement called Touch the Divine that Luna found hilarious and Vaith found deeply concerning, especially after they began selling commemorative t-shirts. "I have been sent 347 proposals for revised contact protocols," Luna announced one afternoon, finding James in what had become his usual spot in the palace library, a chamber where books existed as both physical objects and holographic projections, depending on their age and fragility. "Several of them are remarkably thoughtful. Several others suggest we have perhaps overcorrected, and now anyone should be able to hug the Queen whenever they feel like it." James looked up from the Astria history text he'd been studying, which was currently displaying an animated timeline of the last 3,000 years. "Let me guess, you're not keen on the mandatory public hugging plan?" "Shockingly, no, though I appreciate the enthusiasm." She settled into the chair across from him, her robes pooling around her like captured starlight. She'd taken to visiting the library regularly, claiming she needed to understand historical precedent for the changes she was implementing. But James suspected she simply enjoyed having somewhere she could sit without formal ceremony. "I did receive one proposal that intrigued me, however, a suggestion that the Queen appoint a personal advisor from outside Astria culture, specifically to challenge assumptions and provide alternative perspectives. That sounds dangerously like someone might be suggesting you keep the human who caused all this chaos around permanently." "Dangerously accurate, yes." Luna's smile was warm. "What would you say to such a position, Ambassador James? Official title would be something appropriately dignified, salary would be adequate, and responsibilities would include attending tedious meetings, challenging 3,000-year-old traditions, and occasionally catching your queen when she stumbles." James set down the history text, watching the holographic timeline dissolve into motes of light. "You're serious?" "Entirely. You have already revolutionized Astria society, helped me remember I am a person before I am a symbol, and introduced my council to the concept of constructive irreverence, which is apparently now a recognized diplomatic approach in our records. I see no reason to stop now." "Karis is going to have a breakdown." "Karis has already had several breakdowns. He is currently in therapy learning to cope with what he calls the new uncertainty of protocol. His therapist says he is making excellent progress." Luna leaned forward, her golden eyes bright with something that looked like hope mixed with mischief. "What do you say? Will you stay and help us figure out how to honor our past while actually living in our present?" James thought about Earth, about the posting he'd accepted expecting a year of careful diplomacy and cultural observation. He thought about the last few months, about Luna's laughter when he'd made an ill-timed joke during a particularly tedious budget discussion, about the way the Astria people had started looking less like porcelain figures and more like living beings. He thought about Kessa, the sister who'd found ceremony boring, and how Luna had started telling stories about her publicly, sharing grief instead of hiding it. "On one condition," he said finally, "no execution clauses in the employment contract. I've developed a preference for staying alive. I believe I can accommodate that request." They shook hands on it, the gesture so ordinary it was revolutionary, and James felt that same electric tingle where their skin touched. Luna held on a moment longer than necessary, her thumb brushing across his knuckles. "Thank you," she said softly, "for catching me when I fell, for laughing at the absurdity with me, for reminding me that being divine and being alive are not mutually exclusive. Thank you for not having me executed. I feel like that deserves equal recognition." Luna laughed, bright and free, and her luminescence pulsed with genuine joy. Somewhere in the palace, Karis was probably having palpitations about improper protocol. Somewhere in the galaxy, diplomats were writing lengthy analyses of the Astria Reformation. Somewhere on Earth, James's family was likely wondering why his routine cultural liaison reports had suddenly become historic documents. But here, in this library, where ancient wisdom existed alongside new possibilities, a queen who'd been untouchable for 7 years sat holding hands with a human who'd broken her loneliest law, and both of them were smiling. 3 months later, James attended his first formal state dinner as official advisor to the Queen, a title that came with elaborate robes he absolutely refused to wear and an office with a view of the Garden of Reflected Pools. Luna gave a speech about the evolution of tradition that received mixed reviews but standing applause from the younger generation of Astria. Vaith presented James with a ceremonial dagger, which he initially thought was threatening until she explained it was actually a mark of acceptance into the Queen's inner circle. Karis had a minor panic attack when James used the wrong fork for the third course, but recovered with only minimal assistance from his therapist. And when Luna stumbled slightly on the steps afterward, tired from a long day but nowhere near collapsing, James caught her elbow automatically, steadied her, and they continued walking while discussing whether the dessert course had been worth the diplomatic incident it had apparently caused among the Rigelian delegation. Some rules, James reflected, had been meant to be shattered, and some connections, however impossible they seemed at first touch, were worth every broken tradition in the galaxy. Years later, when historians would analyze the Astria Reformation, they would point to treaties and policy changes, to constitutional amendments and cultural shifts documented in official records. They would speak of Queen Luna's wisdom, of diplomatic breakthroughs, of societal evolution measured in legislative sessions and public opinion surveys. But they would miss the simple truth that started it all. Sometimes the most radical act of revolution is just reaching out when someone is falling. Sometimes the most sacred thing we can do is remember that beneath every title, every tradition, every carefully constructed wall of protocol, there is simply a person who needs to know they are not alone. Luna had been wrapped in reverence until she nearly suffocated. James had seen past the divine glow to the woman underneath. And in that single moment of connection, forbidden, instinctive, profoundly human, they had reminded an entire civilization that isolation, however beautifully dressed in tradition, is still a cage. The question isn't whether we have rules that keep us distant from one another. We all do. Some written in ancient law, others carved invisibly into our daily lives by fear, by propriety, by the small voice that says reaching out might be too much, might be unwelcome, might break something we can't repair. The question is whether we have the courage to break them when someone needs us to. What walls have you built around yourself in the name of protection? What traditions do you follow without questioning whether they still serve you? And when someone stumbles, when they need a hand, a word, a moment of genuine connection, will you stay frozen in your designated zone, or will you move? Sometimes the most alien thing isn't the beings from other worlds. It's the distance we create between ourselves and the people right in front of us. Waiting to be seen as more than symbols, more than roles, more than the carefully constructed images we present to the world. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough or foolish enough to reach across that distance and say, I see you. I've got you. You're not alone. The end. Thank you for traveling with us among the stars in this story. If this story touched you in some way, if it made you think about the walls in your own life, we would love to hear it in the comments below. What traditions did you question?